Good morning, everyone. Thanks again to Mike and the organizers for having me here. It's a great honor to be able to talk a bit about the work we have been doing in GREAT at Kaspersky Lab for the past 10 years. So actually my team celebrates 10 years of existence this year. It was just a few days ago. We were looking back at some of the things we researched during the last 10 years while I was in GREAT, and we realized that there's like a lot of things out there, there's a lot of threats. So maybe some of the things that we talked about during the last years. I guess maybe how many people are familiar, let's say, with the Stuxnet? That's okay, pretty much everybody. But other things such as Flame, Dooku, NetTraveler, Red October. These are some of the, let's say, big research that we have been doing throughout the time. And to be honest, this hasn't been kind of risk-free. So I do remember actually, it was in 2010, the Virus Bulletin Conference took place here in Canada, in Vancouver, and I was invited to make a speech about Stuxnet. Actually, one of my colleagues, Alex Gostev, was originally invited to present there, but he couldn't get the visa in time, so he asked me to fill in for him. So I said, sure, no problem. I need to get myself familiar with Stuxnet first. To be honest, back then I was not paying a lot of attention to these big APTs, nation-state things. So I got myself familiar with Stuxnet, and I went to Canada. And the moment I stepped on the stage, I noticed there was a kind of a tension in the air. And especially I noticed there were three guys sitting at the back of the room, like everybody else was sitting, but these three guys were actually standing. And they didn't look very happy at all. And obviously, well, there was something which kind of bother them about this Stuxnet presentation. So later I went to the organizers and I asked them, do you know who are these three guys who actually came just for my talk on Stuxnet, and they left the conference afterwards? So they said, well, those are kind of strange guys. They came, they paid for the entrance with cash. All right, that's a good sign. And I said, okay, so where are they from? And they said, well, they put next to their company name, they put GOI. So I said, what's GOI? And so like, well, government of something. So I think that, some of these things have been kind of tricky. So after the conference, actually I went back to Romania, and about a month later, I went back home, and I got into my home, and in the middle of the table in my dining room, there's a rubber cube with the message, take a break. So my wife looks at the cube and she says, like, why did you put this on the table? And I'm like, well, I didn't put it on the table myself. So she's like, of course, but who put it? So, well, not to scare my wife, I did say that I put it later. But I didn't put the cube on the table, basically. So, doing this kind of research is not always risk-free. I did take a break after finding the cube on my table in my dining room. But only for a few months. And afterwards, I realized that this is like not the right way. So if you give up to fears, then you will never be able to do important and big threat research. But maybe a few words about maybe everybody's favorite subject nowadays, fake news. The 2016 USA elections, I was in Barcelona with my team, and one of my guys from the US, I asked him, who do you think is going to win the elections? And he said, I'm confident it will be Hillary. I said, why? Well, he said, there's this guy who is doing predictions for the New York Times, and he's got pretty much all the results correct for the past 10 years or so. So I said, you're absolutely confident? Yeah. So, all right, the election days come. The next morning I wake up, I go to Google and I Google for elections. And the first hit, Google, shows a photo of a young lady, something like this. And like, well, what's going on? Well, everybody knows what was the result of the elections. But this is one of the few nice pictures where you can see both the candidates looking, smiling, and most of the other pictures, they either one of them looks bad and the other looks nice and so on. But maybe not many people remember that before the elections, there was a guy called Guccifer. And why is this important? Because Guccifer was the first guy who claimed that he was able to break into Hillary's famous email server. And he not only said he was able to break into the server, but he said there's like many other guys there, like it's me, the Chinese, the Russians, and so on. So actually, who was this guy? Well, known by his full name, Marcel Lazar Leher, a Romanian guy, Guccifer was actually a Romanian hacker and a taxi driver. And the reason why he chose this name is because he said he combines the style of Gucci with the light of Lucifer. So kind of weird. He's like probably got some issues up there. What's amazing about Guccifer is that he had no skills. He had no knowledge except what he found on the internet. So he was a self-taught hacker, basically. Some people would call him maybe a script kiddie. But nevertheless, he was quite successful. He was able to hack Colin Powell's email, members of the Rockefeller family. He was able to hack the emails of several FBI and US Secret Service agents. He was able to hack Corina Crețu's email and Georgia Mayer's email. And of course, many people wonder who are these, like, and why do we care? Well, Corina Crețu was actually a Romanian politician. And it's quite interesting to know how he was able to hack into her email. He got to her, well, he knew that she has a Yahoo account. So he went there, he tried to reset the password. That one of the questions was the name of the city where she was born. And because she's a politician, everybody knows where she was born. She's born in a city, was born in a city called Brăila. So that's the first question. The second question was the name of the street where she grew up. So what he did was actually he tried all the street names in Brăila until he got the right street name. And that's how he was able to hack into her account. Now the more interesting guy is Georgia Mayer. Well, this was basically the top man in the Romanian intelligence. He was the head of the Romanian intelligence service. And he was able to hack into his email. And not only that, but he tried to blackmail him, which is kind of funny, of course. He also tried to call him a skunk, and he tried to get some money from him for not releasing the emails. Now, while Guccifer was hacking the emails of FBI agents, Rockefeller, and so on, nobody pretty much cared in Romania, I guess. But when he hacked the top man into the Romanian intelligence, well, 2 weeks later, he was arrested. So he was put into jail, basically, and awaits extradition to the United States. So that's the story of Guccifer. Now, why this is relevant to the elections? Everybody probably remembers the famous DNC hack, and basically CrowdStrike, which is a great company, a lot of respect for them, they were hired by the DNC to investigate the hack. And after the investigation, they wrote a blog post and they attributed the intrusions into the DNC to 2 different hacking groups, one of them called Fancy Bear, also known as Sophacy or APT28, Pawn Storm, Tsar Team, many names. The other one known as Cozy Bear. Why this was interesting? Because almost immediately a new guy appeared going by the alias Guccifer 2.0, and he set up a blog post on Blogspot, and he, what he said was, CrowdStrike is trying to convince you guys it was the Russian intelligence, but actually there's none of the sorts. It's just me alone, a lonely hacker, and actually I can prove it. Here's some documents which I took from the DNC network. So, initially, of course, this was a huge blow, and it's hard to, sometimes it's hard to understand which one is right, obviously. We had no doubts that CrowdStrike was right, and Sophacy and Cozy Bear, Cozy Duke, have actually been in the DNC network. But what was going on with Guccifer? And quite a few people actually tried to talk a bit to him and see what's going on. One of my friends, Lorenzo Franceschi-Bicchierai from Motherboard, he tried to interview Guccifer 2.0. And he asked him, where are you from? And he said, I'm from Romania. And Lorenzo is Italian. You know, he tried to talk a bit with him in Romanian, for instance, asking, do you speak Romanian? Sure. Why did you put Russian metadata into the documents? And he said, well, este filigranul meu, which means it's my watermark. And then he said this, he repeats this word filigrane or filigran. He actually repeats this word a couple of times. And now, well, any Romanian speakers in the audience? Wow, quite a few. Have you ever used this word before, filigrane? One guy, interesting. I think I have friends, maybe my age, who probably never used this word in their life. Unless, you know, maybe you work in printing or something like this. It's a very, very unusual kind of rare word. And not only is that, by Guccifer 2.0, he was making quite a few mistakes when he was trying to talk in Romanian. So obviously, why was he doing all these mistakes? So actually, if you go to Google Translate, you know, and it's my watermark, you get this este filigranul meu. I think that anybody in Romania, they would say este watermarkul meu. So we'll just use the English word for the same purpose. Nobody will use the, let's say, dictionary translation of watermark. So yeah, that kind of gave Guccifer away that he wasn't who he was claiming to be. And it wasn't until recently when the Department of Justice indicted a couple of Russian intelligence officers for this hack. And it's quite interesting. They were able to pinpoint this Guccifer identity to a couple of these guys. And they say, how do they know? Well, they're quite confident it was this group behind the blog post, because basically they were searching on the internet for some English terms just to make sure they use correct English, such as some 100 sheets, some hundreds of sheets. Like, you know, sometimes it's hard for non-native English speakers to find the plural of 100. Is it some 100? Is it some hundreds? And so on. And later, they used these exact words into the blog post which they published on WordPress. This is the copy of the blog post and the exact words they were searching on Twitter. So it didn't took long for the US intelligence to be able to point who was behind this attack and this disinformation campaign. So it was quite interesting that there are still missing parts of the DNC story. So not the, let's say the entire story is clear. For instance, there's been this indictment which deals with the hackers known as Fancy Bear. Actually, it's amazing. There's basically zero mentions at all in the indictment about the other hacking group, this one, Cozy Bear. So actually, it was quite an unusual hacking group. They were very dynamic. They were very active back in 2014, 15, 16. And then at some point, they just simply disappeared. So everybody lost track of the Cozy Bear. We also call them the Dukes. And my company, we were the first to publish about them in 2014 under the name Mini Duke. So at the moment, like, everybody's kind of wondering, where are the Dukes? So it's just one of the open questions in this whole hacking of the US elections saga. So the whole story about Guccifer and his well, let's say, unusual usage of Romanian words, it got me thinking. And I was wondering, can we find these kind of watermarks between different attacks? And can we actually build some kind of a system which will allow us to pinpoint future attacks to previous incidents and to connect hacking incidents across the time? So that's how I got, I started thinking about code similarity. And actually, I remember very well what was happening on the morning of May 12, 2017. Anybody remembers this date? Well, I was in the office. It was a Friday. Usually, you want the Friday to be quite, quiet, peaceful. So the last thing you want to hear on a Friday is for one of your guys to write you a message and say, we have an emergency, there's an outbreak. And you look like, man, it's a Friday. It's like, you don't want to, like, who wants an outbreak on a Friday? That's kind of a terrible thing. And like slowly news started to appear. This is how computers were looking like, some of the computers in a industrial control center. This is the Desigual, a very posh clothing brand from Spain. Hotel, Sberbank, which is a Russian bank, got hit by that. The transportation system in Frankfurt was also hit. ATMs in Hong Kong and Singapore. And pretty much WannaCry was kind of everywhere. And that actually led people to make some funny versions of this attack. Actually, I hear Nokia is having a comeback with these old phones. Well, like the battery lasts for 1 year or so. Not the usual stuff we have nowadays. Microwave ovens, washing machines, Google glasses, air conditioning, smart. Well, WannaCry was pretty much everywhere. Nintendo. Yeah, that one's my favorite. Yeah, like the Matrix was kind of owned by WannaCry. And as the story was unraveling, I was in the office. The family was upset. Like, what are you doing in the office through the weekend? We have an outbreak. And my wife asked, who is responsible for this outbreak? I want to punish them. And I was like, good question. I don't know yet. And honestly, it wasn't until Monday when Neil Mehta, he's a researcher working for Google, he posted this message on Twitter. And the moment that I saw the message, I said, damn, he's right. And of course, a few other people asked, what does it mean by this message? Actually, it's just a few numbers. So if you look at the message, actually, it's pretty obvious for everybody, I guess. If not, it's just, what do we have here? We have there's 2 hashes. So he means here's these 2 samples. And here's 2 different offsets in these 2 different samples. And that's like one encrypt attribution. So what do? I open these 2 samples myself. You have them here on the screen. One of them is a version of WannaCry 1.0 that was originally used in March. So we were in May, version WannaCry 2.0. But in March, someone used this WannaCry 1.0 to attack like a different number of companies, not as many as WannaCry 2.0. And the other one is a malware sample from a group known as Lazarus, which has been previously associated with the North Korean hackers. So what do we have here? We have basically fragments of code which are the same across WannaCry and these older Lazarus samples that were used in the 2014 attack against the Sony Pictures Entertainment. So it was like, for me, it was pretty obvious that this is like an amazing way of identifying new attacks and seeing who is behind them. And it allows you to very quickly understand, but actually, how can you do something similar to what Google was able to do here and Neil Mehta wrote about? So the full story is the following. In 2011, Google bought a company called Zynamics. And I had a meeting with a Google engineer in 2014. We were working together on a project. And I asked him, how can we search for other samples which are similar to this one? And he said, it's easy, man. You just spin 10,000 machines and you do a string search in parallel. So I said, nice. I went to my CTO and I said, boss, can we buy 10,000 machines for this task? And, well, you guessed the answer. And then in 2017, Google was able to link WannaCry to the Lazarus group. What's interesting is that actually Google is not the only company which has such technology. Another company, a Romanian company called Binarly, they developed the same technology, and later they were acquired by CrowdStrike. And there's also an Israeli startup at the moment called TASER, which has pretty much the same capability. So I thought that this is something that, in my opinion, will kind of reshape the way we do threat intelligence. So this is something that we need to have as well, and probably every other company should have the same. So the only question is, how do you do that? And you have to do it like at a huge scale. You have to do it like with big data, right? And there isn't like the theory behind it, the mathematics is not that hard. You just generate, let's say, all the possible 8 or up to 16 byte substrings from the samples, and then you just check for overlaps. The only problem is that our malware collection is about 5 petabytes at the moment. So doing something like a search across these 5 petabytes takes about 2 weeks. And we don't have budget to purchase 10,000 machines for this particular task. Our goal, is to protect our users, but this doesn't look like it's a very efficient way of doing it. So one of the ways we thought we could actually use a tool called YARRA for this. How many people are familiar with YARRA? Excellent. YARRA is basically, in a nutshell, is a very nice tool created by Victor Manuel Alvarez, also known as Plusvik. He's a Cuban programmer who works for VirusTotal, was purchased by Google. And he created this language which allows you to search for interesting patterns across malware samples. So he calls it actually the Swiss knife for malware researchers. So how can we, let's say, combine this with the big data and try to emulate what Google was doing? Well, first of all, the idea is not to use all the possible combination of strings from a file, but maybe first identify the relevant ones. And you build a YARRA rule from the interesting strings in a sample, and then you just use that YARRA rule later across the collection. Now, there's, let's say, a few drawbacks to this problem. One of them being that let's say 100K file, there's obviously 100,000 16-byte substrings in that sample. So even after you filter out the clean one, and for that you need to have a very good clean collection, so a set of clean files. You take all the strings from the clean files, you weed them out from the suspicious samples, and you're still left with about 30,000 strings based on our experience. So how do you know, let's say, which ones are interesting and which ones are not? Here's a typical example. Like the string on the top is a quite interesting string. It can be used for this kind of searches, but the string at the bottom is not very useful. Even if it doesn't appear, let's say, in many clean samples, as you can see, it's full of CC. Anybody, any idea what CC means? Intel x86 opcodes. Well, it's the int3, so it's a debug instruction. So obviously, anybody can have these debug instructions in their code. So it's not necessarily interesting. But if you extract the interesting ones, and the idea, how do you know which ones are interesting? We built a basically machine learning system. We trained it with the samples, and we discovered that some of these strings based on Markov chains are actually more efficient at finding code overlaps. So here's an example. This is a YARRA rule that our system built for something called Shadowpad. I'll mention it later. So these are all shellcode fragments which appear in this shellcode in these Shadowpad samples, but they do not appear in any other clean or malware samples. So of course this system can be improved. You can first test it across your big APT samples collection, find if it detects other APTs by common strings. You modify the rule to keep only the strings which hit across different samples from the same threat actor, and then you run it using some big data like VTMIS, which is VirusTotal Malware Intelligence System, or Clara, which is our own equivalent of that. So just some numbers about this system. We process about 250,000 samples per day with it. It knows about 56 million known clean samples. So those are like Notepad, right, from Windows. They are not malicious. From which we extracted about 6 billion strings, and it has about 10 billion of known good opcodes. So let's see actually what we can do with this amazing system, all right? So we had like a very interesting engagement. I think it was around August 2017. A bank called us and they said, well, we kind of think we're infected with something, but we can't find it. So can you guys come over and take a look? So sure. Well, a guy from my team went to the bank and he said, why do you think that you are infected? And I said, well, in our network monitoring, we observed a couple of DNS queries for a number of domains, which result like in NX, non-existent. And they come from the system which we use to make the big payments. So that's the system we use to transfer money across the SWIFT network. And the only issue is we check the system and we can't find what's wrong with it. Like there's apparently nothing wrong. There's no malware detected. And we did our best looking for new files and any signs of something which could be wrong with the system, but we can't find it. So what my guys did, they did a memory dump of the system and then they searched for those DNS names in memory. They found a process which was issuing this DNS request, and they found it was actually a tool from a company called NetSarang. It was a remote administration tool that the bank was using across all of their servers. And well, the first thing they did, we took this tool, we found it, the code was issuing the DNS request was in a DLL inside this NetSarang software. So we looked and we were trying to understand why the software behaves in this way. And there was a kind of a payload that was encrypted. So we were wondering if this isn't maybe the normal behavior of the tool that it has this payload inside. But later we discovered that this encrypted blob only appeared in the last version of NetSarang, which the bank installed like a week ago. So we got in touch with NetSarang. They discovered that they have been compromised and they have been used in a supply chain attack. And it's amazing, you know, how this software, which is used by Fortune 500 companies, was used as an entry vector into all these high-profile institutions like financial institutions and so on. So we used our system. We were trying to understand who was behind this attack. So we used our system on the code from the NetSarang incident, and we actually discovered that it's similar to something called poison plug used by a WinNTI subset group. Actually, a few hackers from the WinNTI APT, how we call them in 2014, were just indicted by the FBI. I think maybe it was just 2 days ago. And it's funny that the names and the aliases of one of the guys from the indictment appears in our research paper from 2014. So our system immediately found this overlap with a sample used by an APT known as Barium. If you Google Barium, you'll find a few mentions of them. They've been responsible for a number of high-profile breaches into one of them, which is maybe more known publicly, was a breach into ThyssenKrupp, where they tried to steal some submarine schematics. So if you're wondering exactly what the code does, it's actually a function they use to calculate hashes of APIs. So we immediately assumed that this Shadowpad incident was related to these guys. Another interesting case was the CCleaner incident, which was another very big supply chain attack. Actually, it was much bigger than the NetSarang compromise, because there's about 20 million users of CCleaner. So one day, a piece of code appears in CCleaner, magically, which does kind of shady things. And all the people who have CCleaner installed, they get the update, and the malicious code obviously reaches out to the CNC and tries to do bad things. So again, we used our system to check what's that. And we immediately found a custom base64 encoding subroutine inside the CCleaner code and an older sample known as Missile, from an APT group known as APT-17. I guess the most significant attack from APT-17 is the Aurora hack, which I think it made Google pull out of China a couple of years ago. Here now they're going back. So I immediately, I put it on Twitter that we think that this is related to this Axiom APT, and it's quite interesting that in TASER, the Israeli company that I mentioned, they immediately posted pretty much the same thing, that their technology also thinks that it's related to APT-17. So what we did actually, using this YARRA rule generated from the CCleaner, we ran it on our collection, and it hit a number of samples known as missile, ZOX PNG, and HiKit. So as we are looking at this, we are quite familiar with all these samples, and actually there is an amazing presentation about this missile. And actually missile is a hacker name, is a hacker alias. And this guy, missile, well, there's a very, very good presentation from Chris McConkie at PwC. You can find it on YouTube. And he talks about the methods he used to identify this guy. So he was able to find his name, pretty much everything. And if we look into the Noveta report on this group, and Noveta published one of the best reports about this APT group. They actually said that some of the tools, such as ZOX PNG, Gresham, and HiKit, they're actually only used by Axiom. Our belief was actually the guy who built these tools for Axiom is also somehow connected to the CCleaner incident. And later, we were even able to connect the CCleaner and the Shadowpad incidents together, suggesting that the same group was responsible for both these supply chain attacks. So here's another example when actually this fails. It's very nice when it works out, but what do we do when it fails? So the Olympic destroyer attack, which I guess some people remember, during the Olympic Games in Pyeongchang in South Korea, there was like a significant destructive attack which took down like some of the infrastructure they were using. And the first thing that we saw in TASER, the same company, they published a blog and they said they found similarities between Olympic destroyer and APT-10, which is a Chinese APT group, APT-3, which is another Chinese APT group, and APT-12, another Chinese APT group. So people immediately assume, all right, so probably it's the Chinese again. But then Recorded Future, which is another company working on this kind of code similarity technologies, they posted quite a large analysis of that, and they said that it's actually similar to Lazarus, Lazarus being a North Korean APT. So we have one company saying it's Chinese, we have another company saying it's North Korean. So what is it? So actually, if we look at the code, and we have a Lazarus Blue Norov tool on the left side, on the right side we have a Olympic Destroyer tool, there's actually some similarity. They're not identical, but there's for sure like a similarity in the code. So nobody can actually contest that they are similar in a way. So what we did when we saw this, we ran our code similarity technology, and we're very disappointed that it didn't find similarities with Chinese groups. It didn't find any code similarities with North Korean groups. However, it was quite interesting that it was able to find a small, tiny similarity with a Lazarus APT sample that was used during the Bangladesh bank heist. So how many people are familiar with the Bangladesh bank heist? All right. So this sample actually had and our system pointed out that there is like this fragment which is exactly the same between the Olympic destroyer and this Bangladesh bank heist attack. And the code sequence, well, it's not actually a code sequence, but the byte sequence is exactly that one there. So what is it? That is actually the so-called rich header. So whenever you compile a file using Visual Studio, they embed like a watermark, right? A Filigran of the compiler and the tools which are used to build that sample into the header. So when we saw this, like, what's the chance that across the several billion samples that we have only two with this unique combination, and one of them is from the Olympic destroyer attack, the other one was used in Bangladesh. So like the probability is absolutely huge that the same guys are behind the attack. However, something didn't kind of, pan out. And the trick here was when we started looking in depth at Olympic destroyer, we realized that the rich header didn't actually match the version of the compiler based on the code in the sample. So it almost looked like someone actually copied the rich header from the Bangladesh bank heist attack and put it into these new samples as a very elaborate false flag. So what's interesting is that our technology didn't find any code similarities, but it did spot this header, false flag. And we are now actually confident that the Olympic destroyer was not related to Lazarus and was not related to any Chinese APT, was related to a Russian-speaking hacker group we call Hades. The same group believed to be responsible for the NotPetya, Bad Rabbit, and Ukraine power outages a couple of years ago. So a few other examples. Here's a Wannacry rule, a YARRA rule that you build on WannaCry. We built on WannaCry using our system. It's just 5 strings. That's like all there is to the rule, just 5 sequence of bytes. But it actually catches Blue Norov, the malware used in the Bangladesh bank heist manuscript, which is another malware used by the Lazarus group to hack into banks, and Decafed, which is a keylogger that was also used by the Lazarus APT group. So it's like a very strong link. Now we can actually link WannaCry with all these other tools as well. So this actually makes me believe that probably we are kind of reaching a point where we can start talking about the so-called Attribution 2.0. So what does it mean? Well, I think that tasks which took months before or years can now actually be done in minutes. So in the past, it used to take us a couple of months to be able to say which APT group is behind which attack. And all this can now be automated. I believe that this technology actually, it will become ubiquitous in a couple of years. Everybody will have it for sure. So what that means is that at least some part of the attribution of attacks can now be automated. So it can give us, like, you need to look into this direction. So there's like some new incident with malware, and this is like especially interesting for companies. When you, let's say, you catch an email, and this email drops a malware. Is it targeted? Is it an APT group? Is it for you specifically, or is it like maybe for 5,000 other companies? Are you the only target of that attack? So this can be, of course, partly automated with the right technology. On the other hand, I think this, as an effect, will have, we'll have to see more false flags. So think about this Lazarus malware. It was quite interesting that after the Bangladesh bank heist, and I think it was around April of 2017, the NSA made a statement saying that they believe that the Lazarus APT group is behind the Bangladesh bank heist. And almost immediately, the Lazarus guys, they started including Russian keywords in their malware. Just because I guess it's fashionable to blame Russia for hacks nowadays. Obviously, it didn't fool anyone. Like just having some poorly written Russian words in the malware doesn't fool people. But this can be, it can lead to more sophisticated kind of false flags, like we have seen in the Olympic destroyer, where they try to copy the rich header. And there aren't many companies which actually can spot these kind of false flags. Remember, people have said that it's maybe China, it's maybe North Korea, and so on. So I think as an effect, also we're going to see more reliance on open source tools. And this is like kind of a nightmare. When all the hackers, they start using, PowerSploit, CobaltStrike, Metasploit, like good luck determining who is behind that, because being just open source tools, it means that you cannot attribute it by code to any specific APT group. It will be, pretty much it can be used by anyone. So that is when things will get complicated, and you'll have to use stuff such as, I guess, the network infrastructure, command and control servers to find connections between the groups. So I think that, one last thing which I wanted to mention, I think that actually we as a security community, we're doing quite a good job looking into cyber espionage campaigns, catching APT groups. We're pretty good actually with cyber sabotage, destructive attacks, because both of them, they rely on malware. However, there's probably another dimension to this problem, like the info war, the information war. And I guess that problem is mass opinion manipulation. We are not very good at spotting, preventing, and teaching people on how to recognize mass opinion manipulation. And here I think that we as a community can do more. We can try to use our skills and knowledge in order to fight these kind of attacks and to make people aware of manipulation, basically, and the fact that they are being used. One of the most common questions, from my friends, they say, I have nothing on my computer, I just use Facebook, so even if I get hit by malware, there's nothing, they can't steal anything from my computer. But information, things, the way you think, the way you behave, all this information can actually be profiled, and then it can be used to manipulate you. So I think that if we fail to do that, it can actually cost us our democracy, and eventually it can cost us our freedom. So I'll leave you with that thought. Thank you very much. I hope this was interesting for you.